What if the world's most wanted man wasn't hiding in a cave, but in plain sight, living quietly behind high walls, just steps away from a military base? Welcome to another calm journey into the slow, deliberate side of history, where every detail matters, and silence often speaks louder than noise. Tonight, we trace the gentle ripples that eventually led the CIA to Osama bin Laden. Not through loud battles or dramatic captures, but through patience, shadows, and whispers that stretched across a decade. Before we begin, what time is it where you are? Midnight? 3 in the morning? Or perhaps you're unwinding after a long day? Wherever you are, this story is here to help you drift away. Just relax, and let's begin. Before the satellites circled quietly in the skies, and before covert teams planned in the dark, there was simply a man born into immense privilege, surrounded by marble and opulence, who would eventually become the face of one of the most devastating moments in modern history. His name was Osama bin Muhammad bin Awad bin Laden, born in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia in 1957, the 17th of over 50 children in a wealthy and well-connected family. His father, Mohammed bin Laden, had built a vast construction empire, working closely with the Saudi royal family to shape much of the nation's infrastructure, and Osama was raised in that atmosphere of conservative wealth and religious tradition. But even in those early years, there were signs that Osama was pulled by something more than comfort, that his interests leaned not toward business, but toward a stricter interpretation of Islam and a growing fascination with struggle, purpose, and destiny. During his time at King Abdulaziz University in Jeddah, Osama became immersed in fundamentalist ideology, influenced by professors and preachers who spoke not only of scripture, but of political revolution and religious obligation. When the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979, he saw it not only as a geopolitical moment, but as a divine call to arms, and he answered it. He traveled to Afghanistan, initially funding resistance fighters and later joining them directly in the mountains, enduring harsh conditions and becoming hardened by war. There, he slowly shed the identity of a Saudi elite and embraced the image of a warrior for what he believed to be a higher cause. In 1988, after years of fighting, he helped establish what would become Al-Qaeda, a loosely connected yet ideologically rigid network of Islamist militants determined to strike against what they saw as corruption, Western interference, and the degradation of the Muslim world. Their targets were global, their beliefs unwavering, and Osama bin Laden emerged as their spiritual and operational leader. He saw American troops in Saudi Arabia after the Gulf War. By the mid-1990s, he was issuing public declarations of jihad against the United States, quietly planning acts that would leave deep scars on the world. In 1998, Al-Qaeda carried out devastating attacks on U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, killing hundreds and injuring thousands. These were the opening notes in what would become a symphony of global terror. And then, on the morning of September 11, 2001, the world changed forever. Nearly 3,000 people died in coordinated attacks that shook not only the United States, but the foundations of modern security, diplomacy, and global unity. Osama bin Laden, calm and composed in video statements, took credit in the months that followed. He had become more than a symbol. He was now the face of fear, the architect of horror, and the #1 target of the most powerful intelligence agencies in the world. The United States responded swiftly, launching military operations in Afghanistan to remove the Taliban regime that had sheltered him. But even as bombs fell and troops moved through mountain ranges, Osama disappeared. Tora Bora, a remote cave complex near the Pakistan border, became a focal point of the hunt, and for a time it was believed he had died there. But intelligence was murky, and bodies were never found. And eventually it became clear he had slipped away. In the years that followed, wars raged and governments changed, but the question remained: where was Osama bin Laden? And so began the longest manhunt in modern history. Inside the walls of the CIA's headquarters in Langley, Virginia, a special unit was formed, one dedicated entirely to tracking bin Laden. They listened to intercepted communications, sifted through tips, tracked financial movements, and analyzed every piece of footage or recording released by Al-Qaeda. The search became less about chasing a man and more about chasing shadows, trying to understand his habits, his networks, his environment. It was a hunt made more difficult by bin Laden's discipline. He didn't use phones, didn't send emails, and relied entirely on trusted couriers to move messages between operatives. Years passed, and the trail remained frustratingly cold. Some believed he was still in the caves of Pakistan or Afghanistan, hiding among tribes and sympathetic villagers. Others thought he had died quietly, perhaps of illness or injury, leaving only pre-recorded messages behind. But the CIA refused to close the file, even as budgets shifted and global attention drifted to other matters. Eventually, a name kept appearing in conversations: Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti. He was a courier, whispered about in interrogations and hinted at in classified documents, someone known to be close to bin Laden. At first, he seemed like a dead end. It took years to confirm his real identity, and even longer to determine where he was going. Through intercepted calls, surveillance, and a great deal of patience, the CIA finally traced him to a walled compound in a city called Abbottabad, nestled quietly in northern Pakistan. It was an unlikely place, with clean streets, satellite dishes, and military academies nearby, not the rugged landscape of a terrorist hideout. But the compound was different. The house was larger than the others, with high walls, barbed wire, and strange security measures. No internet connection, no landlines, no trash taken out. The residents kept to themselves, and one tall man was never seen leaving the property. Cameras were placed, satellite images studied, and for the first time in nearly a decade, there was hope, quiet, careful hope. Inside Langley, debates began. Was this really him? Could it be a decoy? How would they know without risking exposure? And what if they waited too long? But those questions, and the quiet planning that followed, the surveillance, the meetings behind closed doors, the growing certainty that Osama bin Laden had been found, that would come in time. For now, this story begins not with helicopters in the night, but with a man who once walked away from wealth and chose a life in the shadows. A man who believed he was carrying out a mission far larger than himself, and who became the most hunted figure in modern history. And the CIA, quietly, methodically, never stopped watching. So let yourself relax now, knowing that the search you're about to follow wasn't a race. It was a slow, deliberate pursuit across borders, across years, and across silence itself. Because sometimes, in history, it isn't the loudest moments that shape the world, but the quiet ones. The path to Osama bin Laden did not begin with a sudden discovery, nor did it erupt from a breakthrough moment of action or confession. Instead, it wound quietly through small details, half-truths, and the thinnest traces of human behavior, like a river carving through stone over time, wearing down resistance by simply not giving up. For years after the September 11th attacks, intelligence agencies across the world operated under a simple, frustrating truth. They had no idea where bin Laden was. He had vanished from the battlefield, withdrawn from the public eye, and removed himself from the modern world entirely. He did not make phone calls, did not email, and avoided every traceable method of communication. His words, when they did surface in the form of occasional video or audio recordings, were sparse and controlled, often sent through multiple hands before appearing on television screens. So the CIA began looking not for Osama himself, but for the people who were still loyal to him. There were whispers of one in particular, a man who went by the alias Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti. It was a name that came up quietly, again and again, in different corners of the intelligence world, sometimes from detainees in foreign prisons, sometimes from intercepted conversations between lower-tier operatives. There was no photo, no confirmed location, only rumors of his closeness to bin Laden and a growing suspicion that he had become the main conduit for his communications. The CIA was cautious with the name. Many leads in the past had turned cold. Many had led to dead ends, or worse, to costly misdirection. But this name, Abu Ahmed, kept returning, not loud or dramatic, but steady and consistent, like a quiet knock at a door long closed. After years of layered intelligence work, cross-referencing reports and tapping deep into human sources, the agency finally uncovered his real name, Ibrahim Saeed Ahmed. He was Pakistani, but had grown up in Kuwait, hence the nickname, and had been active in jihadist circles since the 1990s. He had trained in Afghanistan, fought alongside militants, and over time had earned the trust of Osama bin Laden himself. The pieces were fragile, easily doubted, but they fit together just enough. Now came the most difficult part, finding him. This wasn't a matter of planting a tracker or hacking a device. Abu Ahmed didn't use cell phones, avoided major cities, and moved only when necessary. He lived simply, quietly, and with extreme care. But through surveillance and intelligence sharing, analysts finally traced a phone call made by a known associate of his in 2010. That call led to a vehicle, and that vehicle, after weeks of tracking, led to a city, Abbottabad, Pakistan. It was not a village, not a desolate mountain pass, but a medium-sized city tucked into the hills, a place known for its military academy, its peaceful reputation, and yet that's where the CIA's eyes turned. Within the city, a particular compound caught attention, not immediately and not with certainty, but with a slow, growing interest. It was larger than surrounding homes, with unusually high walls topped with barbed wire, and an outer perimeter that kept prying eyes at a distance. It had no telephone or internet connection, and no signs of a digital footprint, which in itself was strange in a neighborhood where nearly every home had some form of connectivity. Perhaps most telling of all was the behavior of its residents. Trash was never put outside for collection, suggesting they were burning it privately. The occupants did not leave often, and when they did, they were discreet and avoided attention. There were two brothers living in the compound, men believed to be Abu Ahmed and his sibling, and among the residents, analysts noticed something else. A tall man, never seen directly, always moving within the walls, never stepping beyond the compound's limits. It was that detail, more than anything else, that began to shift the mood inside Langley from curiosity to cautious hope. They started calling him the Pacer, because surveillance showed that he spent a great deal of time walking back and forth in the courtyard. He did not go outside. He did not wave or speak to neighbors. He simply walked in circles, alone. He resembled bin Laden in height, in build, in behavior, but it wasn't enough. The CIA couldn't be sure, not without a face, not without voice confirmation, not without risking the entire operation. So they waited, and they watched. Weeks turned into months. Analysts mapped the compound down to the smallest detail, every entrance, every shadow, every pattern of movement. Satellite images were pored over daily. Mock-ups of the compound were built in training facilities, exact down to the angles of the staircases and the dimensions of the courtyard. They even tried to gather DNA from the family's trash, but without trash being discarded, that avenue remained closed. Still, something about the compound continued to hold attention. It wasn't just the secrecy. It was the way everything in the compound was designed to contain, not to defend. It wasn't a fortress, it was a cage. And the man inside, the one who paced in silence, was beginning to look less like a rumor and more like a target. Inside the White House, President Obama was briefed quietly, cautiously, with every detail annotated and every gap in knowledge clearly labeled. He was told there was a high-value target inside the compound, that it might be bin Laden and that it might not. There was no hard proof, no video, no voice, only a theory backed by months of silence and surveillance. The decision to act would not come easily. And yet, across the world, special operations teams began rehearsing, not because a mission was certain, but because if it came, they would have only one chance. They debated endlessly. What if it wasn't him? What if it was a drug lord or a reclusive relative of someone powerful? Would Pakistan retaliate? Would it damage diplomatic relations? What if the operation failed? What if the helicopters crashed? What if the SEALs were killed? What if bin Laden escaped again? Still, the evidence, though circumstantial, was building. The couriers had gone underground. The compound's construction was traced to suspicious sources. The secrecy was too deliberate, too exact. And most compelling of all, no one had seen bin Laden in years, and yet this man in the courtyard behaved as if the outside world no longer existed. He was a ghost, but one with a routine. In the shadows of that courtyard, the past and present were slowly converging. Every footstep he took became part of a larger pattern, a data point added to the mosaic of global intelligence. By the end of 2010, the CIA was ready to say what it had never dared to say before. They believed, with moderate confidence, that they had found Osama bin Laden. But saying it and acting on it were two very different things. What followed was a quiet, tense period of planning, debate, and preparation, one that would eventually lead to the raid on May 2nd, 2011. But before any boots touched the ground, before any helicopters cut through the dark, there was this period, a strange, suspended time. The world kept moving. Markets opened and closed, children went to school, the news cycled on. And all the while, in a quiet compound in Abbottabad, a tall man walked slowly across his courtyard, unaware that the walls around him were no longer high enough to keep the world out. By late 2010, the long hunt for Osama bin Laden had taken a sharp and silent turn, one that would gradually lead the CIA away from the abstract and into something that felt tangible, something real, a location, a compound, a possibility. Inside Langley, the headquarters of the CIA in Virginia, the mood was careful but focused, like standing in a room with one door slightly open, unsure whether to push it or pull back. The intelligence was still circumstantial. No photograph, no audio, no confirmed identity. And yet, for the first time in almost a decade, the pieces felt like they were beginning to align. At the center of it all was the Abbottabad compound, the tall man who never left, and the courier who had led them there. CIA Director Leon Panetta began holding regular briefings in a secure conference room, where each update was delivered with both hope and caution. There were no promises. There never were. But among analysts, a quiet confidence had begun to settle in. Not loud, not celebratory, but steady and unshakable. The man who paced the courtyard moved like someone who had nothing to prove and everything to protect. President Barack Obama was brought into the loop more directly in the fall of 2010. He was briefed not with bold claims, but with humble detail. PowerPoint slides, satellite photos, behavioral profiles, and phrases like high-value target and limited intelligence confidence. He listened, asking questions with a lawyer's calm, weighing every word. not jumping to conclusions. To make a decision of this magnitude, to authorize an operation that could change everything, he would need more than intuition. But intuition had its place, too. He looked at the evidence, the patterns, the man who walked the same path over and over again, hidden behind walls in a military town. Something wasn't adding up, or maybe it was. He instructed the CIA to continue surveillance and tasked his national security team with beginning a parallel discussion. If this was bin Laden, what would they do? There were options. They could bomb the compound with precision-guided munitions and erase the entire site in minutes. But that would mean no confirmation, no body, no photographs, no evidence. And if it wasn't him, they would have destroyed a home, maybe killed a family, maybe ignited a diplomatic nightmare. Another option was to work through the ISI, Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence Agency. But trust between the US and Pakistan had eroded since the early days of the War on Terror. There were growing suspicions that elements within Pakistan's military or intelligence services might be sympathetic to Al-Qaeda, or at the very least, too conflicted to be trusted with something this sensitive. And then there was the third option, the riskiest. Send in a small, elite team, on foot, by night, but it would mean flying American forces into the heart of Pakistan, into a city with a strong military presence, without notifying the Pakistani government. If anything went wrong, if a helicopter crashed, if a firefight broke out, if the mission failed, the consequences could spiral quickly, so the administration did what governments often do when faced with risk. They waited, and planned, and rehearsed. At a remote military site in North Carolina, members of SEAL Team 6, the Navy's most elite counterterrorism unit, began training in silence. The CIA had provided exact dimensions of the compound, which military engineers had recreated using plywood and canvas. The SEALs ran the drills over and over, practicing entry points, stairwells, room clearances, rooftop exits. They didn't know for sure who was inside. They were told only that it could be someone very important. Meanwhile, back in Washington, a tight circle of advisors met regularly in a small room at the White House, known as the Situation Room. There was Panetta, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, National Security Advisor Tom Donilon, and others, each bringing their own view of risk, law, diplomacy, and politics. Some believed the intelligence was solid enough to act. Others worried that it was too thin, too speculative, and that if they were wrong, the blowback would be immense. It was not just a question of strategy. It was a question of legacy, of law, of international norms. And still, no confirmation came. No new photo, no intercepted message. Only the same image. A man walking his courtyard, silent, consistent, unbothered by the world outside. President Obama asked for contingency plans. What if something went wrong? What if they were captured? What if Pakistani forces responded with force? How would they explain the breach of sovereignty? Would they deny it? Would they defend it? Would the world understand? Every question was followed by hours of discussion, but no easy answers. Still, they moved forward, slowly, deliberately. The final briefings began to shift tone, from if to when, from theory to planning. There were questions about who would lead the raid, what equipment would be used, what air support would be needed, how long the team would have on the ground. The SEALs trained again, this time under night skies with blackout conditions, flying low in modified helicopters designed to reduce radar detection and acoustic signature. Back in Pakistan, the compound remained silent. There were no phone calls, no new faces, no signs of a departure. Whoever was inside, they were staying. At the CIA, a small group of analysts had started referring to the target inside simply as the Pacer, a name that captured both his habits and his mystery. They charted his movements hour by hour, noting when he appeared in the courtyard, when he disappeared, when lights turned on, when they turned off. They knew eventually the National Security Council met for one final, classified discussion. Each member offered their thoughts. The intelligence community estimated a 60 to 80% chance it was bin Laden. The president listened, nodding occasionally, asking again what failure might look like, politically, diplomatically, morally. Then he stood and quietly made the call. Proceed with the operation. The date was set. The team would move in a matter of days. They would go at night, under darkness, with no announcement and no backup plan beyond extraction. Even as they prepared, everything remained secret, from Congress, from the press, from nearly all of the government itself. Only a small group of individuals knew what was about to happen. The president wrote a short letter that would be opened in case the mission failed, a note that would explain his decision to the American people in the event of disaster. And then he waited. And so did the world, unknowingly. While business meetings continued, traffic flowed, children played, and news anchors spoke of unrelated things, a mission was taking shape in the silence beneath the headlines. And in a quiet home in Abbottabad, a tall man continued to pace, unaware that every step he took was being watched, studied, and prepared for. The moment of action was approaching, but for now all was still. No helicopters, no explosions, no headlines, just meetings, maps, models, and the weight of history settling gently over those who were about to make it. When the final decision was made and the green light given, the men who would carry out the mission already knew what to do, not because they had been told in advance, but because they had practiced it again and again in silence, without knowing the name of the man they were meant to find. The unit selected was SEAL Team 6, officially known as DevGru, a group so elite and so secretive that most of their missions never made it into the public eye, operating in the space between war and diplomacy, where absolute precision was demanded and mistakes were measured in lives. There were 24 operators chosen for the mission, most of them seasoned, many of them quiet by nature, all of them aware of the weight of what might await them behind the tall walls of a quiet compound in Pakistan. The men were flown to a forward operating base in Jalalabad, Afghanistan, where final rehearsals were conducted with mock-ups of the compound walls, staircases, and rooms. Every angle was memorized, every possible point of entry drilled over and over until it became a rhythm more than a plan, a kind of muscle memory that left no room for confusion. The compound was to be entered at night, with a zero visibility to the outside world, using stealth helicopters designed to avoid detection by both radar and the naked eye. These were modified Blackhawks, outfitted with sound-dampening rotors and radar-absorbing material. Aircraft so secret that even within military circles, few knew of their existence. On May 1, 2011, just before the sun dipped below the Afghan horizon, the team loaded up their gear. They wore no identifying insignia, carried weapons calibrated for close-quarters combat, and carried extra fuel in the event of delays or mechanical failure. The mood, despite the magnitude of the mission, was subdued. No battle cries, no ceremony, just quiet checks of gear, nods between teammates, and a long, slow walk to the helicopters. At the same time, thousands of miles away in Washington, inside the White House, the president and his closest advisors gathered in the Situation Room. It was a narrow space, dimly lit, with screens that flickered quietly and voices that rarely rose above a whisper. Among those seated were President Obama, Vice President Biden, Secretary Clinton, Secretary Gates, Leon Panetta, and a handful of top security officials. They were not watching a live video of the raid, as often believed, but rather receiving real-time updates through a secure communication line from CIA Director Panetta, who was stationed at CIA headquarters. The raid itself would begin around midnight local time in Pakistan, when most of the town would be asleep, when the roads would be empty and the skies would be still. The helicopters lifted off silently from Jalalabad and began their quiet journey toward Abbottabad, flying low to the ground, hugging the contours of the terrain, slipping through mountain passes and valleys to avoid detection by Pakistani radar. Each operator sat in silence, listening to the soft hum of the engines, reviewing the compound layout one final time in their minds. No music, no lights, no spoken words, just the soft pulse of adrenaline and the knowledge that everything they had trained for now existed in this one stretch of night. The flight lasted about 90 minutes, though to the men aboard, it may have felt longer or shorter. Time had begun to behave differently, slowing down, stretching across shadows. Inside the compound, there were no signs of alarm. The lights were dim. The tall man was inside. The residents, unaware of the approach, had gone to sleep, never knowing that the air above them carried more than just quiet wind. Then came the first small problem. As the first helicopter attempted to hover over the compound and lower operators by rope into the courtyard, something went wrong. The air inside the walled compound was different than expected. Hotter, thinner, less stable. The aircraft, despite its design, began to lose lift. Rather than crash or abort, the pilot made a decision, a fast, deliberate, controlled landing inside the compound walls. It was not part of the plan, but it worked. The second helicopter landed outside the walls, and the SEALs quickly adapted, breaching the compound from multiple points at once. Within seconds, the mission was back on track. Inside the White House, those gathered had no idea of the hiccup. The room remained still, all eyes on Panetta as he relayed short, coded updates. In Abbottabad, the SEALs moved from room to room, clearing buildings with precision, night vision glowing, heartbeats steady. They moved through the guest house, where they encountered and neutralized 2 individuals, likely the couriers, before turning toward the main structure. In the main house, they encountered women and children. The SEALs used translator commands, urging them to move aside, to stay down. The operation was not a slaughter. It was methodical, targeted, focused. As they moved up the staircase of the main house, they encountered another man, likely a son of bin Laden, and then, on the 3rd floor, they found him. Osama bin Laden. He did not surrender. He did not speak. He stood at the doorway of his room, tall, bearded, a presence both familiar and surreal. The SEALs reacted quickly. He was shot twice, once in the chest and once above the left eye. The body fell to the ground. The moment, nearly 10 years in the making, had lasted only seconds. They secured the body, confirming his identity with visual markers, and quickly began collecting hard drives, documents, computers, and any intelligence that could be gathered. Time was short. They had expected Pakistani military response within minutes, but for reasons unknown, perhaps delay, perhaps confusion, no resistance, and just like that, they lifted off, vanishing into the same night sky that had carried them in. The entire operation, from entry to departure, took just under 40 minutes. Inside the White House, Panetta relayed the final update. "We have a visual on the target. Geronimo Ecchia. Enemy killed in action." There was a pause. Some nodded. Some wept. The president said nothing at first. Then he rose, left the room briefly, and prepared for the address he would deliver to the world. But that moment, the one of departure, the one of silence in the skies above Pakistan, remained with everyone who had watched it unfold. It wasn't a moment of victory. It was a moment of stillness, of finality, of a page turning very, very slowly. Back in Abbottabad, the compound burned quietly, lit only by the faint orange glow of the destroyed aircraft. Neighbors woke to the sound of helicopters but didn't yet know what had happened, and in the air above, the SEALs, quiet, still, focused, carried with them the man they had searched for across a decade. The helicopters carrying SEAL Team 6 lifted off from the darkened compound in Abbottabad with the same silence they had arrived in, But now, the mission was complete, and inside the cabin, wrapped in a body bag, was the most hunted man in the modern world, Osama bin Laden. There were no cheers, no celebration, just the low hum of rotors and the soft click of gear being checked as the team began the slow flight back across the border into Afghanistan. The operation had taken 40 minutes on the ground, and now, flying through the stillness of the early morning hours, there was a strange quiet in the air, as if the weight of 10 years had lifted. Not suddenly, but in slow, measured exhales. At the U.S. base in Jalalabad, preparations were already in place to receive the team. When the helicopters landed, the body was quickly transferred to a secure location, and biometric confirmation began almost immediately. They took photographs, samples, and compared everything against decades of known data: facial structure, height, scars, and most importantly, DNA. The results came back quickly. It was him. Inside the White House, the president received the confirmation just after 3:30 a.m. Washington time. He stepped away from the Situation Room and into a smaller private office to absorb what had happened. Outside those walls, the world was still asleep. The sun had not yet risen in most parts of the country. But everything had just changed. Plans were quickly made for a public address. At first, the networks were simply told to prepare for an important national security statement. No further details were shared, and speculation swirled. Meanwhile, inside government circles, quiet messages were passed to key allies, briefing them on what had happened and what the United States would be announcing. At approximately 11:35 p.m., President Obama stepped up to a lectern in the East Room of the White House, and the world began to understand. In a calm and steady voice, he explained that the United States had conducted a targeted operation that killed Osama bin Laden. There were no dramatic words, no theatrical gestures, just quiet, deliberate sentences designed to bring clarity and closure. Outside the White House, people began to gather, slowly at first, then in greater numbers. Some chanted, some waved flags, some wept, and some stood silently, not in celebration, but in reflection. In New York, near the site of Ground Zero, small crowds formed in the night, candles were lit, and names were whispered into the cool spring air. But for many, the moment did not bring relief. It brought stillness. Bin Laden was gone, but the world had changed so much since 2001 that there was no simple feeling to describe his death. They had not been informed of the operation, and the fact that bin Laden had been found living so close to a military academy raised uncomfortable questions. How could he have remained hidden there for so long? Was it incompetence? Was it negligence? Or was there something more? The U.S. government, while careful not to assign blame publicly, made it clear that the decision to act unilaterally had not come lightly. They had considered every possible consequence, and yet they had acted anyway. Back at the CIA, in rooms that had seen years of frustration and uncertainty, there was quiet satisfaction. No celebration, just the feeling of a long, impossible job brought to an end. Leon Panetta addressed his team, thanking them for their persistence, their quiet focus, and their refusal to give up when the trail seemed cold. For the analysts who had spent years listening to intercepted phone calls, staring at satellite images, and reading handwritten notes, it was more than just a mission accomplished. It was a vindication of patience. Meanwhile, the physical evidence recovered from the compound was being processed. Hard drives, flash drives, personal letters, even handwritten journals. Each item was cataloged and studied, offering insight into bin Laden's final years. What they found surprised many. He had remained involved in the planning of terror operations. He had written frequently, worried about al-Qaeda's image, concerned that too many Muslims were being killed in the process. He had been more than just a figurehead. He had remained, in some quiet way, an operator. But what struck analysts most was how removed he had become. The man who once gave fiery speeches, who moved from country to country, had spent his final years in a single compound, surrounded by family, walking the same paths day after day. He was not in a cave. He was not on the run. He had been still, hidden in plain sight, waiting for a moment he likely knew would come. As the story spread, reactions around the world varied. Some governments expressed support and relief, others condemned the violation of sovereignty, and others said little, watching carefully to see what would come next. But across much of the world, especially among those who had lost family on 9/11, the news brought a quiet kind of closure. Not happiness, not justice in the full sense, but an ending. The U.S. government chose not to release photographs of the body. They feared that doing so would provoke unrest, spread conspiracy theories, or be used as propaganda. Instead, they released the facts, confirmed the DNA, and explained the process. Bin Laden's body was prepared according to Islamic tradition, washed, wrapped, and placed in a weighted bag. Then, from the deck of the USS Carl Vinson in the northern Arabian Sea, he was buried at sea. No grave, no shrine, no place for martyrdom, only water and silence. And so, the story ended not with noise but with stillness. No fireworks, no banners, just the knowledge that a man who had haunted the world's imagination for so long was now gone. When the news of Osama bin Laden's death spread across the globe, it did not move like lightning, and it did not crash like thunder. Instead, it echoed, slowly and unevenly, like ripples across a still lake, reaching some shores quietly and others with hesitation. In the United States, the reactions were mixed, not divided, but layered. There were moments of quiet remembrance, where candles were lit and names of the lost were whispered into the air. There were crowds that gathered outside the White House and in Times Square, waving flags and singing, caught in the emotional release of a long and painful chapter ending. But even in those places, there was no single emotion. Some felt closure, others felt numb. For many, it did not erase the grief they had carried for a decade, nor did it undo the lives altered on that crisp September morning in 2001. In the days following the announcement, conversations shifted quickly to the question that few wanted to ask aloud. How had Osama bin Laden been able to live for years in Pakistan, undetected, so close to a military academy, in a city with a strong intelligence presence? The compound in Abbottabad was not hidden in the mountains or buried in a remote village. It was located in a comfortable neighborhood, less than a mile from the Pakistan Military Academy, often called the country's version of West Point. The reaction from Pakistan's government was defensive and restrained. Officials expressed concern about the U.S. violating Pakistani airspace without coordination and called the raid a breach of sovereignty. At the same time, they publicly denied having any prior knowledge of bin Laden's presence within their borders. Privately, many within the international community were skeptical. Had the government really been unaware, or had some within the military or intelligence establishment known and simply chosen not to act? There were no firm answers, only questions that grew heavier with silence. The United States chose its public response carefully. President Obama and his administration avoided direct accusations, choosing instead to focus on the operation's success and the importance of remaining vigilant against future threats. But within intelligence circles, there was growing doubt about Pakistan's reliability as an ally. Years of joint counter-terrorism efforts were now under a shadow. The discovery of bin Laden living comfortably within a Pakistani city strained the already fragile trust between the two countries. In response to the raid, Pakistan's parliament held emergency sessions, and anti-American protests erupted in several cities. For many Pakistanis, the issue was not bin Laden, but sovereignty. The feeling that their skies had been violated without consent, that decisions had been made for them, and that their government had been embarrassed on the global stage. Yet beneath the surface, some citizens expressed quiet shame or confusion, wondering how such a high-profile figure could have lived so close for so long without raising alarms. Internationally, reactions ranged from support to silence. British Prime Minister David Cameron, German Chancellor Angela Merkel, and leaders from France, Canada, and Australia expressed relief and commended the precision of the U.S. operation. Nations that had stood with America in the War on Terror issued formal statements of solidarity and reminded their people of the shared losses they had endured since 2001. In the Middle East, responses were more complex. Some governments, particularly those aligned with the West, acknowledged that bin Laden's death was a turning point, a blow to al-Qaeda's leadership, and a symbolic end to one of the most painful chapters in recent memory. Others remained cautious, fearing that the killing might spark unrest or inspire retaliatory attacks by extremist groups. And in some corners of the internet, conspiracy theories began to bloom almost immediately. Claims that the body was never real, that the raid was staged, that bin Laden had died years earlier. These narratives spread quickly, fueled by skepticism, distrust, and the absence of photographs. The U.S. government, anticipating this, had already debated whether to release visual proof of bin Laden's death. In the end, they decided against it. The risks were too great. The image, they believed, would not silence the doubters. It would only provoke more questions, more anger, more instability. Instead, they stood by the DNA evidence, the burial at sea, and the timeline of the operation. Within al-Qaeda, the reaction was swift. Statements were released confirming bin Laden's death and vowing to continue the struggle he had begun. But the truth was more complicated. His absence created a leadership vacuum that could not easily be filled. The man who had once held the group together, ideologically, emotionally, and operationally, was gone. And while others stepped forward to take his place, the unity of the organization began to fracture. In the months that followed, affiliates in North Africa, Yemen, and the Arabian Peninsula operated more independently. Some even questioned the core direction of the movement. For intelligence analysts, the raid yielded more than just a name crossed off a list. The trove of documents taken from the Abbottabad compound became a window into bin Laden's final years, his thoughts, his fears, and his shifting perception of the world he had helped shape. He worried that al-Qaeda's image had grown too bloody. He warned against killing too many Muslim civilians. He advised his operatives to focus on attacking American targets, not regional ones. He lived in isolation, but his mind remained active, sending letters, issuing guidance, trying to steer a ship that was slowly drifting without him. At home in the U.S., the political impact of the raid was immediate. President Obama's approval ratings climbed. Critics on both sides acknowledged the boldness of the decision. And in speeches over the coming months, the president would refer to the mission as a defining moment, not of vengeance, but of justice. But even in that context, there was restraint. No grand military parade, no spike the football theatrics, just a quiet recognition of what had been done, and what still remained. Because even with bin Laden gone, the war was not over. Extremist groups would evolve, new threats would emerge, and the questions that had haunted the world for a decade about safety, surveillance, and freedom would not disappear with one man's death. And so, while the world slowly turned the page, it did so without fanfare. Bin Laden's face, once plastered across headlines, faded into the background. The compound in Abbottabad, once guarded and mysterious, was eventually torn down by Pakistani authorities, its rubble swept away. And the world moved forward, not forgetful, not at peace, but quieter somehow, as if the story had ended not with a bang, but with the soft closing of a long, heavy book. It began with the faint whir of rotors, not loud, but insistent, steady, and low, as two helicopters glided through the night sky above Abbottabad, passing silently over rooftops that had gone dark for the evening. Most residents slept through it, their windows closed, unaware that something history-shaping was unfolding just blocks away. Inside the compound, things were quiet too. No alarms, no guard towers, no posted sentries. Just high walls, dim lights, and the soft presence of a man who had spent years avoiding the outside world. As the first helicopter descended into the compound, something went wrong. The aircraft lost lift in the unfamiliar heat of the enclosed courtyard and had to make a controlled landing directly onto the grounds. The second helicopter touched down just outside the compound walls, and within moments, SEAL Team 6 moved in, entering from multiple points at once. The team, well-rehearsed and deeply focused, didn't speak as they breached the outer gates. They had practiced this moment countless times, in mock compounds built from wood and fabric, in silent hangars under moonlight and darkness. But this was no rehearsal. This was real. Their movements were slow but deliberate, every step measured, every corner checked, not rushed but never idle. The compound had three main buildings: a guest house, a small annex, and the main house, a three-story structure at the center of the complex. The first target was the guest house, where two men were believed to reside, one of them the courier whose trail had led the CIA here. As the SEALs entered, they encountered two individuals. There was a brief exchange, a warning, a shout, then gunfire. Both men were neutralized. It happened in seconds. The SEALs secured the area and moved on. Next came the main house. The door was reinforced, but not enough to stop the team's entry. They breached and moved inward, fanning out through the first floor with night vision optics casting a greenish glow across the darkened walls. In one of the lower rooms, a woman and several children were found. She shouted, shielding the young ones, confused and frightened. The SEALs did not engage with violence. They motioned her back, signaled for calm, and passed through. This was not a mission to terrorize. It was a mission with one target, and that target was upstairs. The team ascended the narrow staircase to the second floor, each man scanning corners, doorways, alcoves. Another man appeared, young, startled, possibly armed, and in the briefest moment the threat was assessed. He was shot. Not in malice, not in haste, but in accordance with the rules the SEALs had internalized. Neutralize threats, avoid civilians, move forward. They pressed on. Now the team reached the third floor, the final room. The air here was still, heavy with Osama bin Laden stood at the entrance of the bedroom, taller than expected, thinner than he had once been, but unmistakable. He did not raise his hands. He did not speak. He stood there, in the dim light, with two women nearby, and the quiet behind him of a man who had lived for years in hiding. The SEAL in front made the decision quickly. 2 shots were fired, one to the chest, one to the head. It was done. They entered, cleared the room, confirmed the identity. There was no hesitation, no celebration, no time for either. They radioed the phrase, Geronimo, EKIA, enemy killed in action. The code word had been chosen in advance, and with those 3 words, 10 years of searching came to an end. Bin Laden's body was moved to a secure location within the compound. Photos were taken, measurements recorded, and samples prepared for later DNA analysis. Meanwhile, the rest of the team gathered hard drives, documents, computers, handwritten notes, anything that might offer insight into bin Laden's network or future plans. One team member moved methodically through the rooms, photographing each object, collecting what looked ordinary but might contain secrets. They found personal letters addressed to operatives, a journal in bin Laden's own handwriting, stacks of thumb drives, and even videos, many never released to the public. Back in the bedroom, one of the SEALs paused. There was a shelf with a small television, a few books, and some dated cassette tapes, signs of a man living not just in hiding, but in a different time. The room was simple. No golden furniture, no lavish decorations, just a mattress, some blankets, a worn prayer rug. For a man who had once shaken the world, it was a quiet space. Nothing about it suggested power, only distance. Bin Laden had lived in this house with several of his wives and children. He rarely left the top floor. He never used the internet. He walked the small courtyard daily, but never stepped beyond the walls. His world had become reduced to a few rooms, a few trusted people, and a fading connection to the movement he once led. The SEALs moved quickly now. Time was limited. They knew the longer they stayed, the greater the risk of detection or confrontation with local forces. One of the helicopters, the one that had crash-landed, had to be destroyed. They placed explosive charges and detonated it, the fire briefly lighting up the night sky. The second helicopter, still operational, was loaded with the team and the body. The remaining men boarded a backup aircraft that had been called in as part of the contingency plan. And just like that, they lifted off. The compound, which had stood quietly for years, was now burning. Inside the homes nearby, residents were waking up, stepping into their yards, unsure what had just happened. As the helicopters flew silently back into the night, the SEALs remained calm. They spoke little. They checked their gear. They held on to the body that history would confirm was Osama bin Laden. There were no speeches, no applause, just the knowledge that they had done what they were trained to do, carefully, quietly, and with precision. When they reached the base in Afghanistan, the process of confirmation began. Biometric scans, DNA samples, facial recognition, and in every way, the identity was confirmed. It was over. Years of planning, searching, doubting, and believing, all of it had led to this quiet conclusion. And within that final room on the third floor, where a thin man stood for one last moment, the story that had shaped a generation was brought to a close. When the helicopters faded into the night and the smoke cleared from the walls of the compound in Abbottabad, something settled into the air. Not victory, not closure, but a kind of quiet. The manhunt was over. The figure who had haunted news cycles, speeches, and nightmares since 2001 was gone. And yet, the world didn't change in the dramatic way some had imagined. There were no parades, no great shifting of nations or military tides. Instead, there was reflection. The kind that comes in the soft hours after something long awaited has arrived. At first, the questions came quickly. How had bin Laden managed to remain hidden for so long? Was someone protecting him? Had Pakistan known? The compound had been large, unusual, right in the heart of a city known for its military presence. How could no one have suspected? The Pakistani government responded with investigations and statements. They insisted that they had no knowledge of his presence, that their systems had failed, not their intentions. But trust had been strained. Years of cooperation were now shadowed by doubt, and though the United States stopped short of open accusations, intelligence officials remained skeptical. For many in the intelligence community, the real surprise was not that bin Laden had been found, but that he had never really been that far away. He hadn't hidden in the mountains, hadn't wandered across borders in the dead of night. He had chosen stillness. He had lived in silence, behind high walls and barbed wire, walking the same paths every day, surrounded by family, disconnected from the world he once shaped with his words and his will. And perhaps, in that silence, there was something telling. Perhaps he had known that his influence was fading, that the movement he had sparked had changed without him, that Al-Qaeda was no longer unified, and that new threats were emerging, independent of the man who once stood at the center. In the years that followed, the raid would be studied from every angle. Military experts dissected the flight path, the entry points. The story began to fade, not disappear, but drift gently into the past, like a photograph left in sunlight, slowly losing its sharpness. The compound was demolished by Pakistani authorities in 2012. Not quietly, not without interest, but with little fanfare. Bulldozers came, walls came down, bricks were hauled away, and where bin Laden had once lived, there was nothing. No plaque, no marker, just an empty plot of earth in a quiet neighborhood where children played and street vendors passed by. Even in the United States, the memory of the event softened with time. The nightly news moved on. Other crises emerged, other threats, other names. And while the raid remained a point of reference, a line in speeches, a slide in briefings, it no longer held the center of the stage. For the families who had lost loved ones on 9/11, the emotion remained more personal. Some found peace in the news, others felt nothing. Some said they had stopped thinking about bin Laden years before, that his death was symbolic, but didn't touch the heart of their grief. Because grief, in its truest form, isn't always moved by justice. It doesn't vanish with the fall of a name. It lingers, it reshapes, and it finds its own rhythms. And yet, even so, there was a moment, however quiet, when many paused and exhaled. The mission had ended, the file had closed, and the weight of that story could be placed gently on the shelf. For the SEALs who carried it out, life continued quietly. Most did not speak publicly. Their names were withheld, their faces unseen. Only a few, over time, chose to step forward, to write books or give interviews. And even then, the details were often blurred, shaped by memory, by necessity, by silence. Because some moments in history, no matter how significant, are not told in full. They are felt, and then they fade. Osama bin Laden was buried at sea, from the deck of an American aircraft carrier, wrapped in cloth, lowered into the waves. There was no grave to visit, no shrine to build, no place for his followers to gather. His presence was removed, not only from land but from permanence. And in that choice, there was intention. There would be no monument, only water, only sky, and only stories. Some told in anger, some in fear, some in quiet relief, but all of them moving on. In the years that followed, new threats emerged, new groups, new leaders, new ideologies. Terrorism did not end with bin Laden, but it changed, it fragmented. And with each year, the influence he once held diminished, not erased, but diluted, like ink in water. Today, when his name appears, it is often in past tense, in documentaries, in textbooks, in stories like this. He is no longer a presence, he is a memory, one that shaped a generation and then slowly slipped into the folds of history. And maybe that is the quiet truth of it all, that history does not always end with a final word, a final act. Sometimes it just softens, like footprints in sand, like echoes in the night. And somewhere, beyond the headlines, beyond the questions, beyond the analysis, there remains the quiet image of a man walking his courtyard each morning, pacing, reflecting, fading. While half a world away, others waited and watched, patient, persistent, until one night the search became a stillness, and the silence that followed said everything. And now, as we come to the end of this long, quiet journey, Let the story settle gently in your mind, not as a tale of violence or revenge, but as one of patience, silence, and persistence stretched across time. What began with confusion and fear ended not in noise, but in stillness, with soft footfalls across a courtyard, a quiet decision behind closed doors, and a team that moved through shadows to close a chapter no one had ever planned to write. The raid, the manhunt, the years of intelligence and waiting, they all belong to a world that often rushes forward. Yet in this story, it was the slow, steady rhythm that brought answers. And as the world drifted onward, the memory of those days grew softer, like twilight sinking into ocean waves, leaving only a whisper behind. So if you're lying there now, eyes heavy, thoughts quiet, know that the story has ended. The search is over, the noise is gone, and in its place, there is only calm. Sleep well, sleep deeply, and let history keep its watch through the night.